A crack of cold light splits the sky above a sleepy Minecraft village, and a white-haired stranger steps through, blades at his back and a circle of black iron rings clinking in his palm. Where he walks, the grass wilts and a low, keening wind rises something ancient and hungry answers his call. Moonlight catches the silver on his hauberk and makes the rings wink like cold stars, and the villagers peer from shuttered windows, breath forgotten in their throats, for they have heard tales of such men who trade in secret names and bargain with the dark for power and for coin. He moves toward the village well, where moss grows between cobblestones, and the iron rings hum with a voice only he seems to hear, naming an old word like a key, and the air shivers and bends as though a map has been folded back upon itself. From the field beyond the farm fences, the tall grasses start to blacken, stalks curling as if roasted by frost, and the chickens hush mid-cluck, rigid as statues. Only the jack-o'-lantern perched by the smithy flares orange, its light trembling in a wind groan full of intent and old hunger. A child opens a door just enough to see, and sees only 4 coins of moonlight in the back of the stranger, and then runs to a hiding place beneath a bed of hay. Farmer Jor responds slower, for his hands have made iron and jaw has made bargains before. The witcher feels the crowding of another world the way a wolf smells whether he lays a palm upon a ring and whispers a syllable like an oath, and the rings leap and spin, and then the air tears in slender vertical seams where black shows through like a wound. From each seam steps not a man but a shape, long-limbed and wrapped in shadow, faces like smoldering coal, eyes hollow like wells, garments that rustle like dry leaves. They are silence and hunger, gathering at the village edges like a slow, advancing tide, and their voices are not voices. They do not speak, they utter the sound of distant glass broken, the sigh of pages torn, the hollow creak of a gate swinging open into some night that has no stars, yet when they move no breeze follows, and the torches bend away as though ashamed of their light. Faces press at windows, pupils reflecting silhouettes not human. Black-robed shapes step between fence posts and barns, long fingers brushing thatch and leaving trails like frost, and a dog at the lane's end turns its head, howls once, and falls utterly still as if recalling some ancient spoken command. Now, a boy named Rowan, who has never held stake, steals out clutching a wooden sword and a torch. His steps are clumsy but brave, and he follows the stranger because curiosity burns sharper than fear in youth, and perhaps because stories have taught him that danger is where songs begin. Geralt does not turn, he moves like a man who has learned to listen for the tremor before thunder, and when Rowan backs into a hedgerow, Geralt kneels and speaks to the shapes in a language older than the end itself, bearing a single ring as an offering. Softly now, one of the shadow creatures inclines its head, a motion like a reed bending, and a voice threads through the air. The sound of 1,000 footsteps taken in the dark, of iron on stone, a chorus like the scraping of a tomb. Lid the rings answer in low metallic chimes. Villagers press palms to chests. An old woman crosses herself, though she never believed in saints. For this is the sort of night when the world tilts, doors between places left propped open, and nothing good goes through such gaps without taking a toll, and mothers tuck children beneath blankets. Geralt's yellow eyes flash in the moon like coals. He is neither holy monster nor holy man, but a blade tempered by sorrow and winter. And he listens while the Ringwraiths shadows speak of names, of pale iron crowns, of a hunger fed by tax and promises and old debts. He could have called them to shadow his own passing, to spy and steal and rend, but he calls them to a purpose sharper than wanton destruction. He calls them to be a blade and useful, a storm to be steered against some blacker fate that sleeps beyond the end. Rowan wants to ask 100 questions, but only one escapes him. Why would Witcher bargain with things from the end? Geralt looks at him, and the boy sees miles like scars upon his face, hears a voice like distant bells, because nothing else was left to try and so. When he finishes, the ringwielders stir. A dozen more seems tear open along the riverbank, near the stone bridge, above the bakery, and from each a new cohort steps, pale as dust motes, moving with the terrible unanimity of a single will, and their footsteps make no sound on cobble. They glide through hedges and through the smith's open door, gathering around the square like dark smoke around a candle, and the villagers clutch tools and slings and iron pots, insisting they will fight, though in their hands sticks tremble and the bravest among them taste the salt of fear. Geralt raises no sword, there is no broad gesture of heroics. Instead, he opens a palm and tosses the circle of black rings into the air, where they run like planets, and then shatter into a cloud of black glass teeth that fall and embed into earth like scattered stitches. The rings sink into mud and into thatch and into the seams from which the shapes came, and where iron bites the soil world remembers names. Wraith, Shade, Ringwraith, Spectre, and the creatures that have been bending to Geralt's summons lift their heads like wolves who smell a far-off herd. They do not obey him as a dog obeys, they feel a pact in the metal and in the syllable he spoke. And pacts in such places are older than gratitude, instead they move with a focused hunger, carrying the scent of corridors and obsidian pillars, of endermen with secrets. The first Ringwraith steps into lantern light, and the air screams like anvils colliding underwater. The smell of old iron and grave salt floods the square, and villagers fall to knees, clutching forks in prayer like talismans that may not hold, but some will find courage in odd vessels today. A smith lifts a hammer, but his arms hang like wet cords. A child empties a sling of pebbles, feels the weight of every missed stone. Rowan steps into the square, and though his teeth chatter, he lifts his wooden blade, because stories need at least one small, foolish heart. Geralt watches the boy, and something like an old softness passes over his face. But he does not yield the circle of rings. Instead, he sets another ring upon the boy's palm, an iron cold and humming, which makes Rowan wince then laugh, for pain and wonder make kin together. The rings hum threads into the boy's bones, binding shadows not by chains, but by purpose. They look to Geralt as one looks to a spearhead, and at his nod begin moving down the lane, past the well toward distant nets and briars where hedges hide what should not wake. At the bridge the Ringwraiths pause, lining the planks with black like a winter, and from the rippled surface of the river a light rises, cold as bone, and an armored silhouette steps up, a creature taller than the Ringwraiths, with plates like night sky and eyes like obsidian lanterns. It speaks without a mouth, a sound that makes the hair on Rowan's arm stand straight and makes the rings in the earth hum back in acknowledgement. The creature's voice is like an ocean of iron, and it names itself with a word that leaves frost on the villagers' windows. A hush sweeps the square like a hand, and in that silence even the creak of a wheel sounds. Foreign blades lower, and villagers look to one another with questions that have no answers, while Rowan holds his ring, feeling the end like a distant bell in his chest now. Geralt remembers prices paid for bargains in blood and lullaby. He knows what a ring can do to a soul, and yet he thinks of hearths where children wake to smoke, of collapsed minds and a darkness that gnaws, and decides sometimes new monsters are medicine against worse fates still. Geralt bows his head, not in submission but in calculation, for the thing upon the bridge is older than the bargains he knows, and when it extends a gauntleted hand, a sound like graves opening, and Rowan feels the world tilt as the creature offers a pact. Silence held for a heartbeat, then broke like glass. The Ringwraiths did not arrive as singular terrors, but as a succession of void-breathing shadows poured through the Enderman Gate, a blackened ripple in the sky that smelled of obsidian and lost stars. They spilled into the overworld in ranks like spilled ink, their robes brushing the pixel grass and leaving dew-black tracks. Geralt felt their chill against his armor, though he was many paces removed. A hunter who had known darkness in 100 tongues, even he tasted the old dread of men who never saw the sun again. The Horde moved with a patience older than hunger, a cadence synchronized not by sound but by the hollow heart they all shared. Where they passed, the light-flattened torches guttered, and slabs of cobbled stone seemed to lean away, as if repelled by their presence. Around the Ringwraiths clustered the Endermen, tall and ravenous, drawn like moths to the new eclipse. They tilted their dark heads, white eyes gleaming with curiosity and contempt, handling blocks with those delicate, manicured hands as though weighing a new kind of meal. The Endermen did not want to fight, they wanted to understand. The Wraiths did not speak. They were a chorus of absence that only Geralt, by virtue of something both Witcher and Summoner, perceived as a directive. Take, claim, convert. The rift pulsed again, and more shadows spilled out, each spectral form more ragged than the last. Like garments worn by long snows, a villager stood rooted at the edge of this gathering, an old mason who had seen distant wars in block and word. His mouth shaped prayer into a handful of soft stones that fell silent as the Ringwraiths passed. He had no sword, only a stone axe, but his knuckles remembered the ringwork of the world. When the foremost wraith turned its head, that sliver of a skull where a face might have been angled toward him as if recognizing an old ledger entry. The villager flinched backward, the simple arithmetic of his life collapsing. His children, his garden, his weathered roof. He began to hum, a low, trembling tune of lullabies taught by mothers beneath the sky, and the sound was a thin defiance. One of the wraiths reached for him and did not touch him. It merely observed the tune as one might read a label, then turned away for more appointment book work of the otherworld. Geralt stepped forward, silver blade low in his hand, though he had not yet swung. The metal of his sword picked up no shine under that paw. It looked like every blade he had ever carried, and also like nothing known to the world of blocks. He could feel the old marks on his palms. The price paid, the ritual contracted. The summoning had been partial, a gamble with a world-straddling ledger. He had called them to seal a breach, to drag an infestation of corrupted Endermen into a binding of fear and obedience, no more than that. But summoning is a tidy word for bargaining with hungry ghosts, and the Horde had answers of their own. A wind arrived from the forest, carrying the scent of spruce and char, carrying a fragment of a campfire song from some distant traveler. It raised an old banner nailed to a rotten post, that red cloth that had hung for seasons, and snapped it like a tongue. Farther off, a minecart clattered as if indifferent work continued in caverns beneath the earth. For a moment the world behaved as if unchanged, stubborn and ordinary, and then the ground itself sighed. Where the Ringwraiths walked, slabs of grass browned and pixelated animals paused, ears twitching at a frequency beyond their coding. A flock of block sheep jumpered away in a cluster of woolly panic. A spider, its eyes gleaming like polished coal, flattened against the side of a tree and considered its options in stark geometric math. Fight, flight, or freeze. Geralt did not call out to the wraiths, for speech with them is not speech but a remembering of debts. Instead, he unrolled the sigil-scarred parchment at his feet, the one that had bound them in part. The ink on that paper had been drawn from pools of drowned moonlight, and blistered coal, its runes curved like iron vines. In the margins were the warnings he had not heeded. A price swells as a summoning grows. He had counted the cost in silver ingots and in the shape of the sky, but some prices are older and paid in other currencies. Children's laughter, the glow of the distant end portal, the geometry of the world itself. He set the parchment down as close to the gate as he dared, and watched as a studious wraith bent to inspect it, fingers dissolving into smoke as they passed through the paper with no interest in consumption. The parchment fluttered and then lay still, its inks no longer singing. The lead wraith, there was always one that seemed to wear the crown of absence, glided toward Geralt. It did not clothe its head in the grand helm of legend, rather it wore a hood with a rent in its seam, as if the world had sewn and then ripped it again. Its presence was not loud, but it was complete, like a bell whose silence fills a cathedral. It studied the Witcher as a chronicler might, assessing the margins of a new story. In the space between them, the air crackled with a static that was not electricity but the memory of old wars. Geralt's lips moved. Whether he prayed, cursed, or read the names of the dead was a thing only he knew. The Ringwraith tilted its head and then performed a small, absurd gesture, an imitation of bowing, a mockery of courtly grace. Geralt answered with the smallest incline of his chin. Between men and monsters, all politeness is a veneer underneath. It lies negotiation by no sooner had the exchange begun than the smaller details of the village answered back. From a thatched roof, a child threw a stone in a twitching arc and hit a wraith's robe. The sound of stone on fabric was ridiculous in its simplicity, and it echoed like a bell in that space where silence had wanted to rule. The wraith's head flicked, and then an odd thing happened. It looked surprised. It leaned toward the sound, and in that lean, the spell that had held the Endermen's fascination loosened. The Endermen stepped closer, their hands empty, their eyes curious. One reached out and touched a Ringwraith's sleeve and did not burn. They regarded each other as two lineages meeting across a banquet table. The Ringwraiths murmured, "If such a thing is possible," and the sound was like pages turning, bureaucratic and inevitable. Geralt seized that sliver. If the wraiths could be ruffled by a child's pebble, perhaps they could be nudged by other small, human things. He remembered the old songs of his mother. He remembered the way certain melodies had once pulled monsters into sleep. He drew from his pocket a shard of glass, smoothed by river stones, and ran his fingers along its edge until a note rose, thin and crystalline. He had never been a singer, but music is a mathematics all its own. He hummed a low tune, an old witcher's lullaby, jagged with iron and moon, and the note rolled out like a wedge between the wraiths. The lead figure paused, as if considering whether the sound belonged to a memory it had been denied. The Endermen did not understand music, they understood gestures. They mirrored Geralt's motion, turning the shard in their long fingers as if examining a firefly. Beneath the wraith's robes, something else stirred. Where a human chest beats and labor and life are counted, the Ringwraiths contained an absence that could be coaxed into form by thought, by a spell, by a word, by a memory. One of the wraiths drew its hand across its visage and gave a small, human sigh. That faint breath threw dust into the air, and the villagers shielded their faces, coughing at a dustiness that had no business in their lungs. It was then that Geralt realized the bargain had not failed, it had only shifted. He had asked them to bind, and they had chosen instead to become interested. Interest, in the ledger of the dead, is a dangerous currency. The first clash came not from steel but from code. A creeper, thinking itself unnoticed, padded too near and detonated in a blossom of green. The explosion was a clumsy noise compared to the silence of the wraiths, and yet it did what loud things often do. It broke the spell of complacency. The blast scattered a small flock of bats, sent a rain of gravel, and upended the orderly procession of those who had been following the Ringwraith's lead. Endermen scattered like sudden storms across the lawn, some ducked into trees. Some carried off misplaced stones as token offerings. The wraiths, affronted by the violence, turned as one toward the little crater left by the creeper. Their shadows lengthened, reaching like spilled night to touch every darkened corner. A child screamed, high and raw, and for a heartbeat the world looked like it might snap back into the ordinary. Geralt's mind moved with the efficiency of someone who knew that moments build battles. He set his sword point into the soil, anchoring thought and fate into the ground, and began to recite the binding in a voice that was not quite his own. The words were old, picked from the margins of a codex that haunted him across years and realms. They tasted of iron and river mud, of basalt and the slight metallic tang of redstone. As he spoke, runes appeared in the air, soft at first, like mothlight, then sharpening into blocks of glyphs that hovered between man and wraith. The Ringwraiths answered with a sound like leaves falling in a cathedral. Not speech, but an agreement being chewed and spat out. The sigils Geralt invoked did not command obedience, they offered reminder. They recalled the Ringwraiths to contracts long forgotten, ways in which the dead had once been shepherded by those who kept the balance between worlds. For an instant, Geralt saw a cascade of memories, fields of obsidian where soldiers had yearned for warmth, rusty gates that had once barred demons, a tribunal of blocky judges who had weighed souls. The wraiths paused in their movement through these recollections, and a fissure opened in their unanimity. Some turned to leave, tempted by some distant administration of the dead they had once known. Others lingered, hunched over the new pleasures of the overworld. Glowstone-like lanterns of stolen stars, the complexity of redstone wiring that tickled ghosts like new toys. In that hesitancy lay Geralt's leverage. He moved through it like a man threading a needle, pressing with both sword and song. He offered them a pact calibrated not in coin but in purpose. Take the Endermen who delighted in devastation, accept their service in exchange for the sealing of the gate that birthed such anomalies. Do this, and you will bind yourselves to an order older than hunger refuse, and be turned into the very thing you now resemble, mere shades with no will beyond haunting. The wraiths considered the contract with the slow, judicial slowness of death. They had lived through edicts and safer bargains and knew the taste of promises once kept. The lead wraith floated close enough that Geralt could see, etched beneath its hood, a faint pattern of blocks, perhaps a map, perhaps a scar. Before the answer came, the environment answered for them. Lightning forked from a cloudless square of sky and struck the nearest oak, igniting it in a halo of flame that rendered shadows sharp as knives. The villagers rallied, picking up tools that were suddenly banners. Some brandished pitchforks, others flung themselves behind crates and makeshift barricades. Courage blooms in small, desperate gardens, and the townsfolk's decisions were not elegant, but they were urgent. Children who had been crying now helped, passing water buckets in a human chain that accomplished miracles in microcosm. It was the kind of heroism that knows no epic song and yet makes emulatable histories, ordinary hands keeping the extraordinary at bay. When the wraith spoke finally, their voice was not one voice but an alignment, an order issuing protocol. They agreed to the binding, but with conditions that smelled of old law. They would require dominion over certain thresholds, access to corridors of shadow, a claim over the night watchings of the world. Geralt weighed each demand like a jeweler appraising gems. He accepted some, denied others. In the exchange, he felt the ledger balancing, a scale that creaked but did not collapse. He had bound partial obedience to an oath with a loophole like a small seam, one he hoped would let freedom slip through should the bargain sour. As the sun slid away behind a blocky horizon, the gate's edges began to thin. The Endermen, having found new toys in the Ringwraith's silence, drifted back toward their obsidian spires, carrying with them curiosities like trophies. The wraiths retreated too, not banished but chartered into service, a dark cavalry assigned to borders that Geralt would mark and maintain. The villagers cheered in a ragged sound, more relief than triumph, and their song rose like a cobbled prayer to a world that had been nearly unstitched. Geralt stood alone on the trampled grass, feeling the contracts in his bones like old scars warmed by sun. Yet even as the immediate danger receded, the Witcher knew the story had not ended. The gate had been bent, not destroyed. The Wraith's bargain had been struck with margins and conditions. The Endermen had learned the taste of human music and the feel of glass. The world would absorb these changes like water into dirt, and later crops would grow stunted or strange or stronger for it. He sheathed his sword and listened to the night settle, a patched, uneasy thing, and thought of that small, absurd moment when a child's pebble had rerouted fate. Sometimes, he mused, the world changed not because of titanic blows but because of pebble and lullaby. He would mark the hours, return to the gate, and when the hour was right, he would come with ledger in hand, ready to shape the terms of old debts so that the world of blocks might breathe another day. The story had forked. The path ahead hummed with the quiet work of mending, and Geralt walked into that hush like a man who had learned that monsters could be bargained with, but never trusted in full. The wind had a different weight now, a pressure that bent the cubes of grass and made the birch leaves click like coins against a palm. Geralt felt it on the back of his neck, the way a Witcher always feels, whether that is waking instead of sleeping, a preface to something inhuman trying to slide into the world. He did not look back. Looking back was a luxury when the border between realities had been opened with hands stained by old contracts and older mistakes. The Enderman gate breathed behind him, a yawning lattice of obsidian and eyes, and from that lattice the first of them poured, not as men but as riddles given shape. A black tide with the glint of iron riding mounts that were not horses but biomechanical nightmares stitched from withered bone, and the brittle armor of drowned knights. Their cloaks were made of absent light. When they moved, the shadows in front of them hurried to keep pace. They called, not with voice but with a hunger, and the hunger had the cold geometry of the end, a sound like obsidian scraping obsidian, and beneath it, a high keening that made the pixels of distant torchlight tremble. Around Geralt, the world rearranged into something older, the blocky horizon folding into vertical spires, a suggestion of towers that were not yet built but belonged in a tale of ruins. A few Endermen paused on the fringe, their tall necks cocked as if listening to a language neither wholly foreign nor wholly known. Their pupils narrowed. Geralt felt a kinship, awful and immediate. The Endermen had always been guardians of distance and stasis, keepers of the cracks between worlds. Now some of them stepped away, trembling, as if recognizing in the ringed riders the echo of a master they had never served. He had expected contempt from the Ringwraiths, which is what witches and kings and monsters give one another in any realm. But what walked through the portal was hunger first and positionless command second. They sought something beyond his summoning, a hunger that smelled of rings and of worn, whispered promises. The Horde scattered like spilled coal, each figure taking a lane between birch trunks and stone ovens, crossing the pixelated commons where villagers still peered from shuttered windows. Their eyes were not bright, they were deep, like holes where stars had been removed. Geralt did not summon to control. He summoned to bargain. That was a truth as sharp as silver when he had made the choice, a ledger kept with a hand that trembled only in private. In the trade-silvered air, he had traded a sigil of his adherence, a loss of something small and secret and human, for the obedience of the Ringwraiths, creatures born under a different story and tethered to a new hunger by a sigil more stubborn than sleep. He thought of Yennefer's laugh that had been no laugh at all and of torches wasted on empty towers. Now, as the riders moved like spilled shadow across the plains, he realized how thin a leash could be when the beasts on the other end had been made to remember what desire meant. The first clash came by the ironworks, where a pair of adventurers had been laying rails. One of them was small, a player with a cape printed with a fox whose eyes glittered like emeralds. The other bore the chiseled jaw of a veteran, who had spent too many nights beneath spiders and creeper thunder. They fought with the bravado of those who have practiced death as a sport, swords flashing that could cleave through cloth and bone, a bow twanging, an iron golem lumbering forward and catching the edge of one wraith's cloak. The golem's fist closed upon illusion and felt nothing but the empty wind. A ringwraith took its wrist and smiled a hole of sound, and the iron that made men safe clattered to the stone like useless armor dot from the tree line. A chorus of endermen hissed, a sibilant alarm, and then one of the tall, lanky wardens stepped forward and pressed a palm to the air. Its teleportation was a physical thing, a folding and unfolding of space that made the world hiccup. The Ringwraiths answered with a flurry of their own, moving through the spaces between blocks like ink on parchment. Where they touched the ground it blackened, the cubed grass going brittle as if turned to ash. Where their capes brushed a villager's fence, the wooden post shuddered and cracked. Geralt moved like a man who had been carved out of narrower choices. His silver sword hung at his hip, but he had used the blade as a reference, not a solution. He murmured signs in a language the Minecraft knight did not fully understand. Igni's spark kindled along the edge of a torch and refused to die. But sign and spark were small things against the deliberate, ceremonial cold of the wraiths. He called Ard and sent a pulse that was felt more as a shock to stone than to spirit. A ringwraith staggered, as if struck by a cut of air, and the horse-rider pair dissolved into a shimmer for a heartbeat before knitting back together. Geralt realized, with a clarity that tasted like iron, that the riders were not made to be slain by slashes or by fire. They were made to be undone by their own making. He should have left the gate sealed. That thought coasted through him like a last, cold lead that might have been used as a nail. But the world had a memory of deals kept and deals broken, and the Ringwraiths carried the memory of a ring whose influence had spilled like dark dye. They wanted to find something that had been hidden by the minecarts of history. A small circlet left at the bottom of an abandoned mineshaft. A ring of ender pearl and iron hammered together and stained with enchantment. In the wrong hands, it would be nothing more than a curse. In the right ones, it would be an armature around which their power could coil, keep them from the shafts. He said to no one and then to everyone, because commands do not require addressees when the world answers. The adventurers obeyed with the quick decisions of those born in survival. They pushed villager carts and torches into the mines, sealing the doors with stone and redstone that clicked like the teeth of judgment. One young miner used dynamite with a grim, reckless joy and collapsed. A shaft entrance, but the Ringwraiths were patient. Their patience was a weapon that did not clang on armor. They circled like carrion around a lanterned ignorance. Up in the skies, the Ender Dragon, roused from a long slumber by the tremor of otherworldly malice, turned its great head. Its wings were slabs of night tile, and where they beat the clouds were scattered like broken maps. The dragon had no reason to care for Geralt, but the alliances of the world reassembled themselves in crisis. It dove, a living shadow turned to living terror, and the Ringwraiths lifted to meet it as if the mounted riders were birds that had been taught to fly by grief. The dragon's roar was a thing that rearranged the saddle of clouds, and for a moment, sky and earth became a chessboard where every piece was death. Geralt's mind was a ledger. He thought of old prophecies recited by old women in villages with no more than 3 houses, of the shape of destiny seeing itself in black and white blocks. He thought also of the cost of spells that stitched one realm to another. You could stitch a fabric if you did not mind the moths that came with the needle. The Ringwraiths were moths that wanted not only to eat, but also to be warm. They wanted anchors. This was not their world, but they would make it so in the time it took a torch to burn down to a nub. He did not like the thought of what they might do to the end. If the end leaned toward the One Ring in any strange way, it might remember a crown, and crowns had a way of unsettling dragons. He moved through the chaos with method. He found a child of a villager holding a bucket of blue dye and taught the child, in 2 short sentences, how to place it like a marker, a simple sigil that would guide someone back and would mislead the hungry. He bribed a librarian with a story and in exchange got a scroll of old enchantments that made the Ringwraiths look distracted, like animals sniffing a false trail. He lit a line of redstone dust that had been worked by clever hands and watched as the current of it hummed with a sound like insects. The world around them became organized by tiny gestures and accidents. The placement of a log, the closing of a shutter, the sound of a bell that tolled like a small, stubborn god-a girl with an enchanted helmet stepped beside him, her eyes reflecting the pale glow of floating ender crystals. She was a player who had walked through doors Geralt had never opened. "You meant to bring them here," she said, not accusing, merely stating a fact like the way rain is a fact. Her voice was steady, the voice of someone who had buried friends in pixel graves and buried regrets in the same way. "I meant to bargain," he answered. The confession was neither lightweight nor unnecessarily heavy. He had always found that truth in a dangerous room was a simple thing. It could cut or cure. The girl looked at him with an economy of trust and then nodded to the others. They formed a thin line, an improbable phalanx of players, villagers, and a witcher who had once made choices in worlds that twined like threads. Helmets gleamed in torchlight, swords were sharpened in the small, bright way of people who knew how to remove a problem. The Ringwraiths assembled then, as if called by a chorus. They put aside the pretense of being riders and became instruments, moving with a purpose that folded the land into new shapes. They did not speak, but the land seemed to take up the words for them. Houses closed their eyes, farms wilted, a path 1,000 blocks away turned abrupt, as if someone had excised a chapter from a book. Geralt raised his sword. The blade caught light and made a sound like a bell struck in a deep cavern. It was a small sound among many, but it was also a statement. Around him, the improvised line braced itself. For those brief heartbeats, all of them, witcher, miner, dragon, golem, girl with enamel helmet, became a single thread in a tapestry that might be saved by stubbornness and by a readiness to surrender things that tasted like freedom. The first rider charged. Where the horse's hooves beat the ground, cobbles blew into ash and then into silence. The girl's enchantment flared and turned to sparks that fell like tiny meteors. One of the riders staggered and then, in a motion that made the air remember sorrow, uncurled its hand. From its palm, a ring of smoke unrolled, seeking a crown. Geralt lunged not with the blade at first, but with a sign that was older than the map between realms. He struck the air, and the sign disintegrated like brittle parchment. The rider howled a sound that was a library burning dot. It was not enough. But as the battle sprawled and contracted, as the Ringwraiths pressed, and the defenders answered with small, earnest things, a pistol of fireworks hurled by a desperate arm, a bucket of lava set like a snare at the bottom of a stair, a book thrown like a charm, Geralt understood the outline of what would have to be done. Bargains are not unmade with steel alone. They required confession, countersign, and a willingness to let go. He had tied the riders to him in part with a sigil of his own, and it was time to see what the price of that sigil would be. He moved then into the curled heart of the battle with a deliberate slowness, the kind learned in a lifetime of noticing how small things never are. Torches popped. Endermen watched with that not quite human interest of creatures who consider humans to be curious, mutable items. Somewhere, a bell tolled again. The Ringwraith nearest him leaned close, and the air around his face felt like an accusation. "Take it." The rider breathed, though no breath came. "Offer it back." Geralt closed his eyes. He thought of the sigils he had traded, of the soft things he had given up to buy the right to command a nightmare. He thought of the ring the riders desired, something simple and terrible that had been hidden in a mine not because it was safe, but because it was a temptation. He thought of the kind of endings that have to be chosen over and over in small escalations, and he decided then what the story wanted him to be. Not a summoner forever, but a man who could balance his own ledger. He reached into his pocket and drew out the last thing he had promised to another life. It was small and worn and had once been named in a language that was not made for blocks. He offered it to the rider, not as surrender but as a last, careful strategy. The rider took it as a moth takes to a light, possessive, greedy, immediate. Its cloak unfolded and swallowed the small ring with a sound like the closing of a book. For a breath, nothing happened. Then the Ringwraith shuddered, and with that shudder the rest of the Horde broke like a wave meeting land. They were less a single mind than a chorus that could be silenced when its lead voice fell. Without their prize, their command faltered. They became more like a memory of cold than a present force. The Endermen hissed and stepped forward, not as allies but as custodians of a balance, and they pushed the riders back toward the gate with gestures that were not kind. Geralt felt a tug, as if a net had been drawn tight about his heart. He did not know who would come to claim the cost of that sigil. He only knew that for this night, at least, the field had been held. Around him, players and villagers and golems caught their breath as if surfacing from deep water. The dragon circled once and then dove away into the clouds, its intelligence a rumor that had been consulted and dismissed. He watched the Ringwraiths recede into the rift, their forms folding into the lattice of the Enderman gate like a story being closed at a precise page. The gate pulsed once and then stilled, not sealed but constrained, like a wound bandaged after it has bled. Night settled back into its old weights and habits, but the world had been altered. The grass kept a scar, and the villagers would tell the tale as they always do, compressing monstrous events into neat tables of fact. Geralt knew the truth would be messier and would haunt the spaces between torches for nights to come. He stood then, among those who had held the line, and felt the drag of what he had summoned, what he had bartered, and what he might yet be forced to trade. In the quiet that gathered like a net, he understood that the end of this battle was only a hinge on a door that had been forced open. Beyond it, the end watched with a patience that deserved respect and a hunger that deserved caution. He had closed the gate for now, but doors in this world were not so easily latched when interested parties had learned that they could be opened. The villagers carried the wounded to their wooden houses, and the players went about their repairs with quiet, ritual efficiency. The Endermen returned to their odd occupations, as if to say nothing proper had happened at all. Geralt sheathed his sword and walked toward the mine, toward the place where the ring might yet be. The night did not protest, it merely waited, like a witness who knows what will be asked of them tomorrow. He had summoned them, and now he would have to pay. The ledger lay open, and the ink was not yet dry.